The Persian Gulf at midnight runs a surface that looks like black glass. No swell worth measuring, no wind above 3 knots, the water so flat that the navigation lights of distant tankers reflect as perfect vertical columns in the dark below them. It is the kind of night that experienced mariners describe as deceptively calm. Deceptive because everything that moves on that surface is visible, and everything that does not move is invisible. And the distinction between those two categories is not always immediately clear on a radar screen at midnight, when the return from a 10-centimeter object moving at 30 knots looks, from the first sweep, almost exactly like wave clutter. Almost. At 11:58 p.m., the USS Arleigh Burke-class destroyer was holding a position 14 nautical miles southwest of Farsi Island on a standard maritime security patrol, its surface search radar painting the Gulf in overlapping circles that cataloged everything from the tankers on the deep water transit lane to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps patrol craft that had been loitering near Farsi Island's northern approach since 9:30 p.m. The IRGCN patrol craft had been noted, assessed as routine, and filed in the watch picture. It was 11 nautical miles north of the destroyer's position. It was not doing anything that 11 years of IRGCN patrol behavior in this specific sector had not produced before. At 11:58 p.m. and 41 seconds, the surface search radar operator flagged an anomalous return. The return was southeast of the patrol craft's position, bearing 023 from the destroyer, range approximately 9.4 nautical miles. It had appeared on 2 consecutive sweeps. Too persistent to be wave clutter, too small to be a vessel of any meaningful displacement, too fast for anything driven by conventional marine propulsion at its apparent radar cross-section. The operator applied the manual discrimination filter, and the return resolved from ambiguous to characterized. A single contact, speed approximately 32 knots, heading 195. A heading that, if maintained, would bring the contact directly to the destroyer's position in approximately 17 minutes. 17 minutes. The tactical action officer received the flagged contact at 11:58 p.m. and 54 seconds, and looked at it for 3 seconds before his assessment emerged fully formed from the combination of the contact's characteristics and the intelligence advisory that had been briefed at the start of the watch. COTAC. Small, fast contact bearing 023, 9.4 miles, heading directly toward us at 32 knots. Size and speed profile consistent with USV. Assess possible unmanned surface vehicle. Unmanned surface vehicle. The 2 words that had migrated from threat assessment matrices into operational reality over the preceding 2 years as Iran developed, tested, and, according to multiple intelligence assessments, began actively employing waterborne drone platforms in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea theaters. Platforms designed to navigate autonomously to a GPS-designated target and detonate an explosive payload against the hull at the waterline. Not fast boats requiring human crews that could be intimidated or interdicted. Not missiles requiring complex launch infrastructure. Waterborne weapons that cost a fraction of the defensive systems required to stop them, and that presented the specific tactical problem of objects too small for most surface-to-air engagement systems and too fast and committed for most organic, close-in defense geometries. The commanding officer was in the Combat Direction Center at 11:59 p.m. He had been there since 11:30 p.m., when the intelligence advisory combined with the IRGCN patrol craft's presence had produced the specific, low-frequency professional unease that had characterized his last 3 nights in this sector. He looked at the contact's track for 4 seconds. The track was clean. The heading was unambiguous. The speed was consistent with every documented Iranian USV profile in the classified technical database. He directed 4 simultaneous actions at 11:59 p.m. and 6 seconds. The bridge was directed to increase speed and begin an evasive maneuver to the south, altering the firing solution geometry that the inbound contact was presumably navigating toward. The Phalanx close-in weapon system was shifted to manual ready posture. prepared to engage on command rather than in its fully autonomous mode, because the Gulf surface at midnight had sufficient radar clutter from the tanker traffic to create an unacceptable risk of phalanx engaging the wrong contact in fully autonomous mode. The MH-60R helicopter that had been on deck was directed to launch immediately, and the Channel 16 emergency frequency broadcast was initiated, directing the unidentified contact to stop immediately and identify itself. No response on Channel 16. The contact continued on its heading at 32 knots. The destroyer's course change began executing at 11:59 p.m. and 14 seconds. A warship at speed, altering course, produced a different radar cross-section than a stationary warship, and a different cross-section meant a different GPS guidance solution for a contact navigating to the last known position of its target. The evasion was not going to cause the contact to miss by a large margin. USV guidance systems with GPS update capability would track a maneuvering target, but it would cause the contact to extend its approach geometry, consuming time and distance that the defensive systems needed. The MH-60R launched at 11:59 p.m. and 22 seconds, 16 seconds after the launch directive. The helicopter climbed immediately and turned north toward the contact's bearing, its radar system acquiring the contact at 11:59 p.m. and 41 seconds at a range of 8.1 nautical miles from the destroyer. The radar picture from the helicopter altitude confirmed the surface radar's characterization and added a visual dimension. The contact was leaving no wake. A 32-knot watercraft of any conventional design at this sea state produced a visible wake. The contact was not producing one. A contact at 32 knots with no visible wake was either semi-submersible or planing at minimal draft, exactly the hull form designed to minimize radar cross-section while maximizing speed on calm water. At 11:59 p.m. and 58 seconds, the MH-60R crew acquired the contact visually at 5 nautical miles in the helicopter's FLIR system. The thermal image showed a low-profile rectangular hull form, approximately 6 to 7 meters in length, with a single propulsion exhaust signature at the stern and no crew positions or structural features consistent with a manned watercraft. No crew, no cabin, no helm position. A flat, featureless deck structure with a forward payload housing that the thermal image showed as a cooler thermal mass than the propulsion section, consistent with an explosive payload compartment rather than a fuel or ballast tank. The contact was an unmanned surface vehicle with a forward-mounted explosive payload. It was at 4.8 nautical miles from the destroyer and still running at 32 knots. The commanding officer had the helicopter's visual characterization at 12 a.m. and 4 seconds and made the engagement decision at 12 a.m. and 7 seconds. The M240 machine gun on the MH-60R was authorized for employment. He simultaneously directed the 25mm Mark 38 chain gun mounts on the destroyer's port side to train on the contact bearing and prepare for engagement as the contact closed to their effective range. The MH-60R crew chief fired the first M240 burst at 12 a.m. and 14 seconds. Range to the contact 4.2 nautical miles. At that range, engaging a target moving at 32 knots with a door-mounted 7.62mm machine gun from a helicopter that was itself in motion required a lead angle calculation and a firing geometry that the crew chief executed through the specific combination of training repetition and focused real-time judgment that the engagement required. The first burst fell short, visible as a line of splashes on the FLIR picture, ahead of the contact's bow by approximately 20 meters. The contact did not alter its course. A manned fast boat under fire would have jinked, slowed, or turned. The contact continued at 32 knots on heading 195. Whatever navigation system was driving it, the incoming fire was not a variable in its decision process. The second M240 burst was fired at 12 a.m. and 22 seconds. The crew chief adjusting for the overshoot on the first burst and applying additional lead for the contact's speed. The burst struck the contact's starboard side aft of the payload housing. The FLIR picture showed impact strikes but no apparent reduction in speed or alteration of heading. The contact's hull construction, low-profile composite or metal structure, had absorbed the 7.62 mm rounds without a disabling effect. The contact was at 3.1 nautical miles. At 32 knots, it would reach the destroyer's hull in approximately 5 minutes and 40 seconds. The MH-60R pilot maneuvered to a position that gave the crew chief a better aspect angle on the contact's payload housing, the forward section where the explosive charge was mounted. Strikes on the payload housing carried a risk of sympathetic detonation, but at 3.1 nautical miles from the ship, a detonation of the USV's payload in open water was substantially preferable to a detonation against the ship's hull at the waterline. The crew chief fired a third burst at 12 a.m. and 41 seconds, aimed at the forward payload section. The FLIR picture showed strike impacts across the forward hull. The contact slowed from 32 knots to approximately 24 knots over a 4-second interval, but did not stop. The propulsion section was still functioning. The payload had not detonated. The contact was damaged and slowing but still on its approach heading. At 12:01 a.m., the contact was at 2.4 nautical miles from the destroyer's current position. The Mark 38 chain gun on the destroyer's port bow had been tracking the contact since 12 a.m. and 30 seconds, waiting for the contact to close within its reliable engagement range against a small, fast surface target. The engagement threshold for the Mark 38 against a target of this size and speed at night was approximately 1.5 nautical miles, a range at which the 25 mm round's accuracy against a maneuvering small target provided acceptable probability of achieving disabling hits within the available engagement time before the target reached the hull. At 12:01 a.m. and 14 seconds, the contact was at 1.7 nautical miles and decelerating further. The M240 hits on the forward section had apparently damaged some element of the guidance or propulsion system, as the contact's heading was beginning to drift 3 to 4 degrees east of its original bearing. Not enough drift to miss the destroyer entirely, but enough to suggest that the contact was no longer navigating with the precision it had been maintaining at 9.4 nautical miles. The Mark 38 engaged at 12:01 a.m. and 28 seconds. Range 1.6 nautical miles. The 25 mm burst struck the contact across its midship section and aft hull. The round's impact visible on the surface search radar picture as a disruption of the contact's return, the hull structure fragmenting under the 25 mm impact energy. The contact's speed dropped from approximately 18 knots to 0 over 7 seconds. It was not moving. It was still floating. It was 1.4 nautical miles from the destroyer's port side, adrift, its propulsion section disabled, its guidance system no longer receiving or processing data. The Mark 38 fired a second burst at 12:01 a.m. and 41 seconds aimed at the forward payload housing. At 1.4 nautical miles from the ship's hull, a sympathetic detonation of the payload in open water was acceptable. The 25 mm round struck the payload housing. The contact detonated at 12:01 a.m. and 43 seconds. The detonation was visible from the destroyer's bridge as a brief, sharp flash at 1.4 nautical miles on the port bearing. A low-order detonation rather than the high-order blast that the payload would have produced against a steel hull at close range, the difference between a warhead functioning against its designed target and a warhead detonating in open water without the confining pressure of a hull surface to direct its energy. The pressure wave reached the destroyer as a faint percussive sensation through the hull plating, the kind of vibration that watchstanders on the bridge noted and logged but that produced no secondary effects. 1.4 nautical miles. The contact had been stopped at 2,600 meters from the hull. The MH-60R continued its orbit above the detonation position for 4 minutes, the crew documenting the debris field with the FLIR system and confirming no secondary threats in the vicinity. The surface search radar showed no additional contacts on approach bearings from the north or from the IRGCN patrol craft's last known position. The patrol craft had not moved during the engagement. It was still at its loitering position north of Farsi Island, its radar return unchanged. Stationary. Watching. The IRGCN patrol craft had not fired. It had not communicated on any monitored frequency during the engagement. It had simply held its position and observed. The 11 miles between its loitering position and the engagement site was a distance that provided operational deniability. A patrol craft that did nothing could not be formally connected to the USV that had done something, while remaining close enough that a crew with a surveillance system could observe and document the engagement's outcome. The commanding officer noted the patrol craft's behavior in his engagement report at 12:05 a.m. and directed a continuous tracking posture on it until it departed the sector. The patrol craft departed toward the Iranian coast at 12:47 a.m., 44 minutes after the detonation, at a speed that was consistent with a vessel completing its observational task and returning to port to report. The after-action assessment was conducted at 12:30 a.m. The engagement timeline was precise: 37 seconds from the contact's first radar detection to the commanding officer's first directive, 8 minutes and 50 seconds from first detection to detonation. Approximately 2,600 meters of standoff achieved between the detonation and the hull. The engagement had consumed 3 M240 machine gun bursts, approximately 180 rounds of 7.62 millimeters, and 2 Mark 38 chain gun bursts, approximately 40 rounds of 25 millimeters. The helicopter had launched, engaged, and maintained continuous observation throughout the engagement. The evasive maneuver had added approximately 200 meters of additional standoff to the final detonation position by altering the contact's approach geometry in the 4 minutes it had been executing. 200 meters from an evasive maneuver that had begun executing 14 seconds after the contact was first assessed. 200 meters was not a large distance in absolute terms. In the geometry of a waterborne explosive approaching a steel hull, 200 meters was the difference between a detonation that created a percussive sensation through the hull plating and a detonation that created a hull breach requiring emergency damage control. The engagement had also surfaced a tactical problem that the after-action report addressed with the clinical precision reserved for findings that were operationally uncomfortable but strategically necessary to document. The surface search radar's initial detection at 9.4 nautical miles had been flagged by a trained operator applying manual discrimination against wave clutter. The automated tracking algorithm had not resolved the contact as a discrete track until 8.7 nautical miles. The interval between the operator's manual flag and the system's automated acquisition represented a detection gap of approximately 45 seconds at the contact's approach speed. In those 45 seconds, the contact had covered approximately 1.2 nautical miles on its approach vector. A contact that was not automatically tracked until 8.7 nautical miles and that was moving at 32 knots had a total engagement timeline of approximately 16 minutes from automated detection to hull impact. 16 minutes was sufficient for the response that the crew had executed. But the pre-mission intelligence advisory had included a technical assessment of Iranian USV programs that characterized a high-speed variant under development. A platform potentially capable of 45 to 50 knots rather than the 32 knots the contact had demonstrated. A 45-knot contact, first detected at 8.7 nautical miles, had an engagement timeline of approximately 11 minutes. A 50-knot contact had approximately 10 minutes. At 10 minutes, the engagement geometry changed in ways that the current organic defense posture, M240, Mark 38 maneuvering, needed to be evaluated against. The commanding officer included this finding in his after-action report as an operational planning advisory rather than a capability gap declaration. The distinction was specific. The current posture had been sufficient against the contact as demonstrated. Whether it would be sufficient against the high-speed variant that remained unconfirmed required a different analysis that he did not have the data to resolve from a single engagement. The commanding officer's post-engagement report to 5th Fleet included a second technical finding that the intelligence community prioritized immediately alongside the detection gap assessment. The contact had maintained its approach heading through 3 separate weapon engagements before the propulsion system failure caused it to drift. A USV guidance system that continued navigating to its target through sustained 7.62 mm fire and debris impact from 25 mm strikes before guidance degradation occurred was a system with significantly greater damage tolerance than the previous Iranian USV assessments had characterized. The previous characterization had assessed Iranian USVs as likely to suffer guidance disruption from small arms fire. The contact had demonstrated that this assessment required revision, and the revision had operational implications for every surface combatant and helicopter crew in the 5th Fleet's area of responsibility. The technical annex to the after-action report documented the specific engagement data that would support that revision. The number of M240 strikes required before speed reduction was observed, the speed reduction profile over the damage interval, the specific impact location that had produced the propulsion disruption, and the payload detonation signature that distinguished a waterborne open-water detonation from a contact detonation against a hull. All of it precisely documented. All of it operationally available to the next crew that faced this specific threat in this specific waterway. The 5th Fleet Intelligence Staff received the after-action report at 2:15 a.m. and immediately tasked a priority review of all existing Iranian USV technical assessments against the engagement data. The review was expected to produce updated force protection guidance within 48 hours, a timeline that reflected both the urgency of the revision and the analytical rigor that producing accurate force protection guidance required. Updated guidance that was wrong was more dangerous than no guidance, because it produced false confidence in defenses that were not calibrated to the actual threat. The IRGCN patrol craft reached the Iranian coast at 1:22 a.m. Whatever it was carrying back from its 44-minute observation of the engagement would take time to process and integrate into whatever planning cycle had produced the USV attack in the first place. That processing time was not the destroyer's immediate concern. The destroyer's immediate concern was the watch that continued after the detonation with the same patient. Systematic attention it had maintained before 11:58 p.m. The engagement had produced something that the Iranian planning team had not intended to provide and could not recover. The 44 minutes the patrol craft had spent observing the American defensive response had also been 44 minutes during which the American crew had been documenting the patrol craft, its position, its behavior, its communication pattern, its departure timing, and the correlations between its pre-engagement loitering posture and the USV's launch geometry. A patrol craft positioned 11 miles north of the target bearing, motionless during the precise window when an Iranian USV was on approach to the target, represented a level of operational coordination that required planning, communication, and positioning that could be traced and characterized. The patrol craft had been trying to collect intelligence on the American response. In doing so, it had become intelligence itself. The MH-60R recovered to the deck at 12:51 a.m. The crew chief conducted the post-flight inspection of the M240, checking barrel wear from the 3 burst engagements, confirming the remaining ammunition count, signing the maintenance log entry that would go to the ordnance officer's morning accounting. He was methodical and thorough. He had fired 180 rounds at a contact in the Persian Gulf at midnight, and now he was checking the barrel because that was the next task in the sequence, and the sequence did not stop because the engagement had. The Gulf was flat and black outside when the deck crew secured the helicopter for the night. The navigation lights of the distant tankers still reflected their vertical columns in the water. The IRGCN patrol craft was gone from the radar picture. The contact's debris field was dispersed on the current, moving south toward the strait. In 12 hours, it would be in the Arabian Sea. The watch continued. That was the answer to the USV, the patrol craft, the surveillance posture, the 11-year study of American escort operations in this corridor. The watch continued because that was what the mission required, and the mission did not end when the threat was neutralized. It ended when the transit was complete and the next ship was safe in the same water and the one after that. The Gulf runs its flat geometry in the dark and asks the same question every night. The answer is the same every night. The ship is there. The watch is set. The radar is turning. That is the line. That is always the line.